They called me the rookie with crazy ideas. When I proposed my defense strategy, Captain Morrison laughed in my face and threw my report in the trash. But when enemy forces surrounded our base at 0200 hours, he had exactly 4 minutes to decide: trust the lieutenant he humiliated or watch everyone die. Before I tell you how that night unfolded, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a story that's never been told outside classified briefings, and trust me, you won't believe how it ends. My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago, I was a fresh lieutenant arriving at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with a brand new uniform, a head full of tactical theory, and absolutely zero respect from anyone who mattered. The desert outpost sat on a strategic choke point, home to 200 personnel who'd been living in relative peace for 18 months. I'd graduated top of my class in tactical analysis, which sounds impressive until you realize that on a real military base, surrounded by veterans who've survived actual combat, your fancy diploma means absolutely nothing. Captain James Morrison was waiting for me when I stepped off the transport helicopter. 25 years of service had carved lines into his face like a roadmap of every battle he'd survived. His handshake was firm, his smile was polite, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I was just another green officer fresh from the academy, full of theories that would crumble the moment reality hit. He walked me to my quarters and said something I'll never forget. "Lieutenant Chen, book smarts don't mean battlefield smarts. Watch, listen, and try not to get in the way." The other officers chuckled. I forced a smile and unpacked my things, feeling smaller with every passing minute. They assigned me to night watch duty, which was basically the military's way of saying I wasn't trusted with anything important. I sat in the surveillance room, monitoring cameras and drone detection systems while the rest of the base slept. Most junior officers would have been frustrated, maybe even bored. But I've always had this thing where my brain won't stop looking for patterns, connecting dots that other people don't even see. And after 3 weeks of staring at those screens, I started noticing something that made my stomach turn. Small reconnaissance drones kept appearing on our radar, just tiny blips, dismissed by everyone as local insurgents doing their usual low-level surveillance. Nothing to worry about, they said. But I started mapping their flight paths in a notebook, tracking the dates, the times, the exact coordinates they covered. What I saw made my hands shake. These weren't random flights. Someone was systematically mapping our entire base in a grid pattern, sector by sector, like they were preparing a blueprint for something catastrophic. The coverage was too precise, too methodical. This was professional military reconnaissance, and it had been happening right under our noses. I spent 2 more weeks compiling every piece of data I could find. I analyzed the drone patterns, cross-referenced them with regional intelligence reports, and built predictive models for where an attack would most likely occur. I barely slept. My roommate asked if I was okay because I kept muttering coordinates in my sleep. But I knew what I was seeing. Someone was planning to hit us, and they were planning to hit us hard. I developed a complete defense strategy, repositioning key assets, relocating our ammunition depot, setting up personnel at unexpected angles. It was unconventional, sure, but it was based on solid analysis. I requested a formal meeting with Captain Morrison and the senior staff. I was nervous, but I was certain. Finally, someone would listen. I had no idea I was about to experience the most humiliating moment of my entire career. The conference room felt like a courtroom where I was already guilty. Captain Morrison sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, while 4 senior officers flanked him on either side. I'd printed out my report, complete with charts, drone trajectory maps, and my proposed defensive repositioning strategy. My hands were sweating as I distributed the copies, but my voice stayed steady. I walked them through everything: the pattern recognition, the systematic grid coverage, the 3-week timeline that suggested imminent action. I showed them exactly where I predicted the attack would come from and how we could counter it by relocating our ammunition depot and repositioning sentries to angles they wouldn't expect. For 20 minutes I poured my heart into that presentation. When I finished, the room was silent. Then Morrison laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, dismissive laugh that made my face burn. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't a video game. This is real war. And in real war, we don't rearrange our entire defensive posture because of some drones that local insurgents probably bought online." The other officers shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke up. I tried to explain again, my voice cracking slightly. "Sir, the pattern is too coordinated, too professional. This isn't random surveillance." He picked up my report, the one I'd spent 72 sleepless hours preparing, held it up for everyone to see, and then tossed it into the trash can beside his desk. The metallic clang echoed in the silence. "Paranoid fantasy," he said. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant." I walked out of that room feeling like I'd been physically struck. The humiliation wasn't just private, it was public, witnessed by every officer whose respect I'd been trying to earn. Within hours, everyone on base knew what happened. I became the Prophet, a nickname whispered with barely concealed mockery whenever I passed. Officers who'd been cordial before suddenly found reasons to avoid me in the mess hall. Even the enlisted personnel seemed embarrassed on my behalf. I'd gone from irrelevant to laughingstock in a single afternoon. At night, alone in my quarters, I stared at my backup copies of the data and wondered if Morrison was right. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe my inexperience was making me paranoid. The doubt crept in like poison, but I couldn't stop watching. Every night on surveillance duty, I kept monitoring, kept taking notes in my personal journal that nobody would ever read, and that's when things got worse. The drone activity suddenly stopped completely. Just vanished. To everyone else, this proved they were right. It had been nothing all along. But to me, it was the biggest red flag imaginable. You don't stop reconnaissance unless you've finished mapping your target. I started noticing other things too. Increased encrypted radio chatter in the surrounding region, unusual civilian vehicle patterns near our perimeter, small details that individually meant nothing but together painted a terrifying picture. 3 days before it happened, I requested a meeting with Morrison, just the two of us. I told him I believed we needed to raise our alert status immediately. He didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Lieutenant Chen, stop wasting my time with your theories. You've already embarrassed yourself enough." I stood there for a moment, wanting to scream, to make him understand. Instead, I saluted and left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the surveillance room, watching the screens, feeling the weight of knowing something terrible was coming and being completely powerless to stop it. I thought about calling regional command directly, going over Morrison's head. But who would believe the junior officer that even her own captain had publicly humiliated? Turns out, I had 72 hours left to find out if I was crazy or if I was right. And the answer would come at 0200 hours with the sound of explosions tearing through the southern wall. The explosion ripped me out of a fitful sleep at exactly 2:03 hours. My body hit the floor before my brain fully processed what was happening. The southern wall, I thought immediately. They're hitting the southern wall. I pulled on my boots and gear in the darkness while the alarm sirens began their piercing wail. Outside my window, I could see flames lighting up the night sky in 3 distinct locations, 3 coordinated breach points. Exactly where I'd predicted, exactly where I'd told Morrison they would come. My stomach dropped as I ran toward the command post, and all I could think was, they knew. They knew our exact defensive positions because nothing had changed. The command post was absolute chaos. Morrison was shouting orders into a radio that kept cutting out with static. Enemy jamming. Senior officers were scrambling to coordinate responses, but everything was falling apart because our defensive positions were exactly where the enemy expected them to be. I heard the casualty reports coming in over the speakers. Sentries down at checkpoints 2 and 5. The ammunition depot under direct fire. Every single vulnerability I'd identified in my report was being exploited with surgical precision. Through the chaos, I caught Morrison's eye for just a second, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. And worse than fear, recognition. He knew. In that moment, he knew I'd been right. I moved to the communications room where at least I could monitor what was happening. The tactical display showed enemy forces advancing through gaps in our defense like water through a broken dam. 15 minutes, maybe 20, before they'd be inside our living quarters. We were losing, and we were losing fast because we'd been too proud to listen. That's when Morrison burst through the door. His uniform was covered in dust, a cut bleeding above his eyebrow. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts desperation and shame. "Chen," he said, his voice hoarse, "where's your report?" The question hung in the air between us like a live grenade. "You threw it away, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was hammering. But I remember every word of it. He moved closer, and I could see his hands shaking. "Can we still implement your strategy? Can we turn this around?" Everything in me wanted to throw his dismissiveness back in his face to make him feel a fraction of the humiliation I'd endured. But there were 200 lives in the balance, and my pride wasn't worth a single one of them. "Partially," I said. "We need to move now." He didn't hesitate. "You have tactical command. Tell me what you need." The other officers stared in disbelief as Morrison stepped back and gave me the floor. The rookie lieutenant who'd been mocked 3 weeks ago was suddenly calling the shots. Terror and adrenaline collided in my veins. "Don't freeze," I told myself. "Everyone's counting on you." I started issuing orders, repositioning key personnel to the defensive angles I'd mapped out weeks ago. We couldn't move the ammunition depot, but there was a small emergency cache I'd quietly hidden in my proposed location, one nobody knew about because nobody had listened to my briefing. We activated decoy heat signatures in our current positions, something I'd secretly set up after Morrison rejected my plan, just in case. The enemy was pushing hard into our strong points, except those positions were mostly empty now. We hit them from the flanks they didn't expect, using the backup communication frequency I'd suggested that Morrison had completely forgotten existed. I watched the tactical display as enemy movements faltered, then stalled, then reversed. Their commander was calling retreat. They thought they'd walked into a trap. At 0447 hours, the last enemy vehicle disappeared from our sensors. The sun was rising, and somehow, impossibly, we'd survived. Dawn broke over Forward Operating Base Sentinel like a revelation, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red. I stood on what was left of the southern wall, my legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash, watching the dust trails of enemy vehicles disappearing into the desert horizon. We'd lost 18 people, 18 souls who would have still been alive if someone had just listened 3 weeks ago. But the projections had estimated over 100 casualties if we'd remained in our original defensive positions. The math was cold comfort. Behind me, I heard boots on gravel. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Morrison. He stood beside me in silence for several minutes, both of us watching the sun climb higher. His uniform was torn, his face covered in soot and dried blood. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, does it?" What happened next? I didn't expect. Morrison called an immediate assembly of all personnel who could stand. 200 exhausted, traumatized soldiers gathered in the central courtyard as the medics continued working on the wounded. Morrison stood on an equipment crate so everyone could see him, and his voice carried across the silent crowd. "Last night, I almost got all of you killed," he said, and the bluntness of it shocked everyone into absolute stillness. 3 weeks ago, Lieutenant Chen presented me with a tactical analysis that predicted everything that happened last night. The attack vectors, the timing, the enemy strategy, everything. And I threw her report in the trash. I called her paranoid. I publicly humiliated her because my pride couldn't accept that a junior officer might see something I'd missed. I wanted to disappear into the ground. Everyone was staring at me now, and I could see the realization dawning on their faces. The prophet hadn't been crazy after all. Morrison continued, pulling something from his jacket. It was my report, crumpled and stained, covered in what looked like coffee grounds and dust. He'd gone back to retrieve it from the trash. "Lieutenant Chen saved this base. I nearly destroyed it." If she hadn't been professional enough to put aside the way I treated her, if she'd let my arrogance cost us this fight, none of us would be standing here. He looked directly at me, his eyes red-rimmed. Never again will I dismiss unconventional thinking. Never again will I let rank override wisdom. That's a promise to all of you. The changes started immediately. My defensive strategy was fully implemented that same day, with crews working around the clock despite their exhaustion. But the impact went far beyond our base. Regional Command launched an investigation into my drone pattern analysis, and what they found made my blood run cold. The enemy had used the exact same reconnaissance technique on 6 other bases across the theater. My strategy was distributed to every installation in the region. How many lives that saved, I'll never know, but I think about it sometimes when I can't sleep. Morrison became a different leader after that night. He started holding weekly sessions where junior officers could present unconventional ideas without fear of ridicule. Our relationship transformed from adversarial to something like genuine mentorship. He taught me the things that only experience can teach, the human elements of leadership that no academy can prepare you for. And I'd like to think I taught him something too. That fresh eyes aren't a threat, they're an asset. That the youngest voice in the room might be carrying the truth everyone needs to hear. But every time I walked past the memorial wall where we'd added 18 new names, I was reminded of the cost of pride. Victory and vindication felt hollow when measured against those losses. Looking back on that night, I realize it changed me in ways I'm still discovering. There's a weight that comes with being right when the stakes are life and death, a burden that doesn't lift even when people finally believe you. The story doesn't have a simple moral. Morrison wasn't a villain. He was a veteran who'd survived 25 years by trusting his instincts, and those instincts had failed him. I wasn't a hero. I was a scared junior officer who happened to see a pattern and got lucky that I was given a second chance to prove it. The real lesson is messier than that. It's about the complexity of leadership, the danger of ego, and the courage it takes to admit when you're wrong. Sometimes being right doesn't feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like mourning the people who died before anyone would listen. But if this story teaches you anything, let it be this. Trust your analysis, but stay humble enough to learn. Challenge authority when you must, but never forget that experience has value too. And if you're ever the person in power, remember that the youngest voice in the room might be carrying the loudest truth. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed for thinking differently, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more untold stories that changed everything, because there are more out there, stories buried in classified files and forgotten memories that deserve to be told. And leave a comment below. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but nobody listened? I want to hear your story. This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, signing off. Stay sharp out there, trust your instincts, and never let anyone throw your truth in the trash.